Welcome back to this special edition of Citizen Business Center with a focus on the U.S. election. Now, businessman Donald Trump is the president-elect of the United States in what can only be described as one of the most divisive elections in U.S. history. On election night 4 years ago, Donald Trump was still the host of The Apprentice. Now, Trump, who becomes the 45th president of the U.S., is the first person to be elected who has no government experience and whose campaign was highly controversial. I believe we'll, be hearing or getting recaps of some of those controversial statements that he made from time to time. But joining us in studio, just to unpack this a little bit for us, is Felix Odhiambo, election expert. And in just a few moments, we'll be hearing on phone from Angela Mbitho of Infotrack, taking a look at those controversial polls. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is also set to join us a little later on. He, of course, has lived in the U.S. for a very long time. He can really give us some perspective with regards to how people there are feeling, particularly those who are not U.S. citizens. But let's start with you, Felix, an election expert. You have followed elections for so many years. Has this come as a shocker to you? Are you one of those people who said, I saw this coming, I saw a Trump presidency coming?
Well, it has come as a shock, and I think it's not just for me, but pretty much everybody around the world. Or it is one election that has completely defied every rule in politics. It has defied all the opinion polls. It has defied the political analysts and analyses that were given before these elections. And I think it's for the Democrats in particular, it's denied them an opportunity to do what the Republicans were able to achieve in 1998 when they had control of the White House for 12 years straight, when George H.W. Bush succeeded Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, so this is the first time in 12 years that they have control of the House, really.
Yes, yes. Yeah. It's a sweep, actually. They won both the Senate as well as the United States Congress.
But here's what's interesting. Election patterns, and just now, Angela will, I hope she can hear us loud and clear, we'll be asking her a question about the polls. But what we saw, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, elections usually have patterns. You can tell when a certain group of people is likely to vote a certain way. This time, yes, we did see a majority white vote, but we also saw minorities, to some extent, voting for Trump. We saw those who voted for Barack Obama in the previous election voting for Trump. Where do you think the tide began to change for them?
Well, I think it's actually been back and forth. And one of the narratives that came in 2008 when Obama was elected for the first time was that the so-called Obama coalition, that to be elected in the United States, you could galvanize the minority, the Hispanics, the blacks, and other minorities to be able to win. But I think with the elections the election of Donald Trump, he's actually changed that. He's flipped it over. He has actually demonstrated that you can still galvanize the white Americans and be able to win regardless of the minority votes.
All right, just a moment, I'll ask you what you think a Trump presidency means for Africa, for Kenya. Angela Mbitho of Infotrack is on phone. And Angela, I think one of the most controversial parts of this U.S. election has been the polls. A lot of people saying pollsters failed. What can you tell us about that? Your own thoughts and observations on the polls in the U.S. election this time round.
Good evening, Janet. Now, if we look at the numbers, pollsters missed it, but not entirely. If you look at some of the polling numbers just before the elections, many of the pollsters actually, predicted that it was too close to call, 3-4 days before the elections, especially with regards to the popular vote. And what we have turned out to see is that Clinton has won the popular vote by a very small margin. She has 47.7 and Donald Trump has 47.5. Having said that, certainly the predictions on the electoral votes were overestimated for Clinton. Whether that was because she was more preferred candidate by both the pollsters, the media, and all the pundits is a question that people will debate for time to come. I think one of the things that people did certainly underestimate, in my opinion, was the groundswell from the rural white American voter. This person who seems to be extremely emotional, extremely pained by what they feel is happening to their country.
Yeah.
And it may point out to how the sampling is done. We have to be honest and call a spade a spade. And Janet, the way sampling is done in America sometimes differs with what we do. In fact, the reason why I couldn't be in studio with you is because I'm in the field and we're doing field work.
Yeah.
But in the developed world, increasingly, what happens is that they buy samples. There are companies that actually produce samples, and then you actually purchase that sample and you use that sample to do your survey.
Or Angela, let me just ask you a quick question, before we let you go back, because you're working. You just mentioned that, and just I stand to be corrected, that the rural white America was largely underestimated. Are there lessons to learn here regarding how polling will be done, say in the Kenya elections, in terms of not necessarily assuming, because a lot of people say the pollsters in the U.S. almost assumed that perhaps certain demographics wouldn't come out in large numbers as they did. Any lessons to learn here as we go towards the elections in Kenya regarding how best to carry out the polling?
I think that's a good question, and it actually hinges on what I was pointing at, which is proper sampling methodology, which means that in this case, I think they may have not captured the rural voice as well as ought to have been done, because had that happened, then they probably would also have estimated that the voter turnout by the rural demographic was going to be very high, because they came out in large numbers.
Yeah.
And conversely, what happened is the expectation that women would come out in large numbers, the minority vote, that's the black African American vote, and the Hispanic vote would come out in large numbers, didn't quite turn out as high as was expected in the strongholds,
right,
and the strong states, the blue states.
Okay.
So the lesson for us, just very quickly, is that the tried and tested methods that we know about and that we are still using in Africa are perhaps things that we should use. While technology is sexy, while technology makes things easy, sometimes it does create the biases that we don't want to see. Internet polls, which are used in the developed world, telephone polls that were used in Britain, and internet polls for the Brexit, a referendum,
all right,
do cause some sway.
All right. Thank you for that insight, Angela Mbitho, InfoTrack, talking to us a little bit about really touching on methodology, Felix. And the point she's made is, in as much as technology can be sexy, and that's a great way of polling, perhaps the more traditional methods sometimes bring out the actual feel on the ground. What do you think a Trump presidency means for Africa and Kenya? We saw people at home are just as shocked as many across the world. Your thoughts on what, if there's any need to be shocked, any need to be scared or fearful in Kenya?
Well, obviously it will probably have an impact, but it's not just the Trump victory in the United States. If you look at the global trend, increasingly the far-right extremism is actually gaining ground. Whether Brexit in England or Le Pen in France, and generally the swing in Europe. One of the effect, of course, would be on the development aid. Normally conservatives, and going by Trump's policy position of America First, that is a policy signature would be to take care of the interests of America first. What does that mean?
Treat everyone else fairly.
Exactly. What does that mean, for example, for development aid, for example? Will it shrink? Will it cut? And every time conservatives come to power, regardless of which country, unfortunately, that is a trend. But Angela obviously is an expert in opinion polling. But I think there is a fundamental question that has to be asked. If you look at the polling in 2012 between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, the pollsters actually also got it wrong. They predicted a tie in the last few days to the elections, and actually gave Mitt Romney Florida, Ohio, and potentially Virginia. And Barack Obama actually won in all those states. So there has to be a question about the methodology, and people really must ask themselves.
And I think that's what she's alluded to, the buying of of these polling papers, the buying of. So obviously saying it's better to do it the more traditional way, if I heard her right. So you're talking about America first and treating other countries fairly.
Yeah.
He talks about, banning Muslims. I know he corrected himself and said, those who are linked to ISIS countries. He talked about deporting illegal immigrants. People without papers in the U.S. right now, how scared should they be?
I don't think they should be. Let me tell you, the positive thing with this election is this, Janet, that ultimately in the United States system works. We've seen peaceful transfer of power. There is very strong constitutionalism, the rule of law, and separation of powers that Donald Trump, even as president, will not have that authoritarian powers to be able to expel anyone without the due process. The other lesson I think that we can pick from this is that the voters all over are the same. Catchphrase and populist statements. I will build a wall to bar the Mexicans. That is the same thing that our African presidents say. When President Robert Mugabe, for example, says that Zimbabwe will never again be colonized. It sticks. It resonates with the rural, especially the rural voters. But also the question that I keep on asking: Donald Trump was able to beat Hillary Clinton on white uneducated women with 28%. What does this mean to women voting for women candidates? And I think these are some of the lessons that we really need to ponder off and reflect on. Yeah,
women voting for women candidates in many parts, I think, across the board. So obviously people have compared this to Brexit, for example. And, we also saw populist statements of people sort of like Boris Johnson at the time, at the height of Brexit. Your thoughts about world leaders, presidents like Duterte of the Philippines, Jacob Zuma. Is there an indication perhaps that world leaders or presidents that voice the opinions of the people vis-a-vis those of quote-unquote the elites are sweeping over? Is there sort of like a change in tide of who people want to see in leadership, in your view?
There's clearly a change. And I think this is something that people and especially historians and political analysts will have to really reflect on, and political parties. If you look at the Philippines, like you've rightfully pointed out, Venezuela, Putin, Russia, and now Donald Trump, Brexit and things like that, there is a clear pattern that leaders of populist orientation and leaders of extreme, far-right wing, if you may say that, are actually winning. What does this mean to the elites? Because the ascendancy of Trump, even if you look at the Republican nomination, was all about challenging the status quo, challenging the so-called Washington elites. And people actually thought that he wasn't going to make it through. When he won the Republican nomination, people say that we doubt whether he'll make it to the presidency. And hold and behold, is the president-elect of the United States. So it's a serious question for reflection. And potentially a research area.
I think so. Really that's what I was going to say. I think it's a research area because, you're the expert. But from where I'm sitting, it does look like a trend and a wave that may probably not go back.
It won't.
And not for the foreseeable future. One or two more questions, Felix. And of course, to our viewers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is on our sister station, Inoro TV. He's live on air, in studio, being interviewed, so he won't be able to make it on set today. However, of course, he's been watched on Inoro TV. Hillary Clinton said that the best days are yet to come in the U.S. And some people think, I don't really see that happening. What are your thoughts on how she conceded her speech, whether there's any hope for those who, wanted her to win but didn't?
I think that actually underlies what I was saying earlier, that in America the system works. It is a clear indication that their democracy works. And one of the lessons that we can learn going to our 2017 election is that regardless of the acrimony, regardless of the polarization and the division, ultimately the voice of the people must be given an expression, and a peaceful transfer of power in terms of the incumbent, for example, incumbent party, as was the case here, conceding defeat, but also a challenger actually also accepting the will of the people for the sake of the country, something that we really need to take from this election. That it might be so bitter, it might be very divisive, but ultimately democracy works.
Finally, we saw again, as was with Boris Johnson, sometimes a loose cannon previously regarding what he said about Hillary Clinton, etc., and likewise Donald Trump, a lot of vitriol in his rhetoric, whether it was about women, about Mexicans, etc. What happens now when he has to go and meet world leaders and, you know, be a president and do duty as a president? How do you think this is going to be transition-wise for him? Don't you think it's a really tall order, a huge task ahead for him, and also looking at whether or not there'll be any interest at all in Africa?
It will be a tall order. I think soon the reality will set in that candidate Trump is very different from President Trump. And if you look at his concession, I mean his victory speech this morning, he actually sort of gave up a presidential speech, if you may, by, for example, alluding to the fact that he'll be president of everybody, including those who voted for him and those who didn't vote for him. But the reality of global politics will also shock him. You cannot, for example, run and dictate on other presidents of sovereign states, pretty much like he did during the Republican nomination and during the general election, where, for example, calling crooked Hillary, using those catchphrases and slogans and things like that. It doesn't work in international diplomacy. It doesn't work in international relations or international politics.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Felix Odhiambo, election expert. Certainly something that we'll be discussing for many, many days and weeks to come until he's sworn in on the 20th of January.
That's right.
Thank you for your thoughts. We take a short break now. Michael Njenga will be back with your business news.